And welcome to the Self-Made Math episode 4. Tonight we are going to cover a couple of timely and topical math issues having to do with COVID relief funds and a recent survey that came out about masking in the schools. We'll take a closer look at that. Before we get started though, as always, I wanted to thank the Coalition Radio Network for giving me a platform to come out and talk about math things. If you're enjoying this content, please hit the subscribe button. It costs nothing. It takes 2 seconds to do. Also, for my own benefit, if you could pick a thumb at the end of the episode, up or down, doesn't matter to me. It tells me how things are going and whether what I'm doing is of interest to anyone. By the same token, also feel free to leave a comment. If you have questions about anything I covered or maybe a counter opinion, by all means, send it in and we can talk about it on a future episode. And as always, if I'm doing new stuff or if I'm referencing something, I always try and leave links to my source documents in the comments section, so that you can go out, look at the full document, and get a better understanding of where I was coming from, and maybe even correct me if you don't necessarily agree with where I was coming from. So with that said, I also wanted to get one other important piece of housekeeping out, and that is to do an unsolicited plug for one of the show's sponsors, Brood Awakenings. So a quick personal story about Brood Awakenings. It was the Monday right after Governor McKee put out the new vaccine proof of vaccination or mask mandate for businesses under 250 capacity. And it was at a time where it felt like we shouldn't be doing that at this point, and that there was enough therapeutics out there, enough vaccines. I don't necessarily want to get political, but for those of us who had had enough of being turned away at the door by different places or repeatedly reminded in stores that you need to wear a mask, it was a little bit of an irritation. So Dave LeBake had made it very clear in an episode right here on the Coalition Radio Network that he would not be enforcing those guidelines and really didn't care what you were wearing on your face, if anything. He was more than happy, he and his staff were more than happy to serve a sandwich and some coffee or whatever it is you wanted to order while you were there visiting with him. And it was just a comforting, great response to something that seemed so out of line from the governor after all we've been through. And I'm involved in a lawsuit on school masking. So my son and I, who's a homeschool student, made a point of focusing on restaurant math. So ordering food, figuring out the sales tax and gratuity. And then after our math lesson, went over to Brood Awakenings for lunch, had a great lunch. It was relaxed. It was low stress. We didn't have to worry about somebody sneaking up behind us and telling us, get a mask on. And for, like I said, everything that we had going into the holidays, it was a welcome reprieve, and I was very, very happy to take my lunch business to someone who was not really too terribly concerned about what I was doing with face coverings. So as always, anytime you're in the neighborhood, stop by Brood Awakenings. And enough on that. So 2 topics tonight and a quick update. We'll start with the update because I have nothing actually prepared to show you on it. But a couple of weeks ago, I did a piece on nickel hoarding, and we saw that you could actually buy 6.3 cents worth of metal, copper and nickel, for 5 cents. And you would do that by going to the bank, buying some nickels for 5 cents a piece. And we determined that the meltdown value of the metal that was actually making up those coins was worth about 6.3 cents, which at some point could produce a profit if only you could sell that coin for 6.3 cents. There were some questions about, well, how long will copper prices and nickel prices support that little endeavor, 6.3 cents. And I'm happy to tell you that a couple weeks into it, the prices of copper and nickel have both nudged up a little bit higher, and that trade still looks pretty good, and you're still getting about a 30% premium on your nickel purchase. So as I alluded to in the first episode, we don't actually have a way to dispose of those nickels for more than 5 cents, but perhaps someday, and in a future episode, I'm actually going to explore the possibility of a secondary market for copper nickels, and how we might in the future be able to dispose of those at a profit for more than the 5 cents we paid for them. But that's a future episode, and today's today, and tonight's tonight. So we will jump into our topics for this evening. So the first one of the two has to do with this COVID relief funding that is coming through. We've heard a lot about COVID relief funds and federal dollars, and in fact, every time we talk about some sort of COVID related restriction or state of emergency or executive order, invariably part of the rationale involves the inflow of federal funds into Rhode Island that can be spent in the state. So I thought we'd take a closer look at that. I'm going to start off by running a clip from the Gene Falicente show, which aired last Friday. It was the weekly Ask the Governor session. But in this, they talked for about 2 minutes about some states of emergency that had been extended, executive orders have been extended, and the rationale behind it. So just so you don't think I'm making things up, let's hear it right from the governor. Okay, so clear as mud, right? We are trying to end the share now, and we're back. So that was clear as mud, but as with all executive orders and states of emergency extensions, there's this idea of federal money coming into the state. And since we all live in the state and we all deal with the ramifications of these executive orders, some of those impact us directly, some indirectly, some not at all, but they frequently involve restrictions of some sort. So I thought it was probably a good time to start looking at what this money actually means to you and me and the people that live under our roof. So I thought we'd do a little bit of math on that, because this is, after all, a math show. And so we just heard from the governor, and we're going to talk about federal dollars. Now, federal dollars take a variety of flavors, if you will. So we got a bunch of money, about $1.25 billion in 2020, to help the state cope with the immediate impact of the pandemic. So everything from PPE equipment to additional salaries, overtime for people who were designated critical within the government and needed to be out there, and testing kits, those sorts of things. But then we got this American Rescue Plan Act that passed in the early months of the Biden administration, and Nobody's really sure what that money's earmarked for, but every state got a slug of money, and now it's up to the lawmakers and the governor to decide how to spend it. The Rhode Island take from the American Rescue Plan Act was about $1.1 billion. So again, it's not earmarked for anything in particular, but our lawmakers have been entrusted to figure out a way to squander or invest that money in the state. And depending on your experience and how long you've lived here, you'll have a particular opinion of which way that's going to go. But what does that mean to you, me, and the people who live with us and our families and our friends? $1.1 billion. Well, we got 1.1 million people, just about, living in the state of Rhode Island. So if we take that ARPA money, as it's known, American Rescue Plan Act, divided by every person, man, woman, child, living in the state of Rhode Island, everybody gets $1,000 if only they were going to distribute it on a per capita basis by head. But in fact, like I said, it's going to be invested in projects that will hopefully bring economic growth and relief to the state. We'll see how that works out. But $1,000 for everybody in here. So that means that if we divide that by 700 days, which is about how long we've been dealing with this pandemic, the federal government is paying you about $1.43 per day over that 700-day period in order to basically, restrict rights, make rules on a whim, enforce whatever measures that they felt like, enforcing on the day without public comment, without any real rationale or explanation or justification whatsoever. So your freedom, your discretion, and your participation in government has been purchased by the federal government in part for $1.43 per day. And like I said, after 700 days, that gets you to $1,000 for everyone in the state. So for that, we can only hope that the investments that our lawmakers agree on, and I say investments in air quotes, we can only hope that those bring a great deal of economic prosperity and benefit to the state. I remain skeptical on that. You probably detected that from my tone, but that is what we're hoping for. But when we get these giant numbers thrown around, $1.1 billion, it's really useful sometimes to put that into perspective and what it really means to you. Because $1,000 per Rhode Island resident sounds like a lot of money. Then you look at how long it took you to get that 700 days. And then you come to the uncomfortable conclusion at the end of that, number one, it's not very much money. And number two, that $1,000 per resident, that was your money anyway, because you're a taxpayer and you were out working or running a business through the pandemic, and you earned that money and you turned it over to the government, and then they gave you back $1.43 every day. So I'm not sure that that's the world's greatest deal. Once again, we can only hope that that money will be invested wisely and spent wisely in the state for the economic benefit of all, particularly those who contributed it in the first place. So that's topic number one this evening. Topic number two is also on the topic of COVID and restrictions, and this one has to do with school mask policy. A lot of people are aware that there's a lot of discussion going on at the State House, probably as I'm recording this, with regard to what are we going to do about extending the state of emergency? What are we going to do about extending the governor's powers? 60 days, 45 days, there's a bunch of numbers being thrown around, dates being thrown around. What's that going to mean for school masks? And there are a lot of strong opinions out there, and the school masking issue is one that I'm close to in general anyway. I've been involved in a lawsuit seeking to end those mandates because they were enacted unlawfully. We're not going to go down that road too far, but just so you know where I'm coming from, I think it's fair to do that. And but as we're having these discussions about whether or not to lift mask mandates, the teachers union has been pushing back very, very hard, and not necessarily teachers, because we heard testimony from them last week about the impact that these mandates were having on the kids in the classroom, what they were observing in terms of mental deterioration, emotional damage, just behavioral changes that aren't normal or healthy as a result of the stress and strain that comes with wearing these masks all day and being forced to comply all day. But the unions have been very vocal in the fact that this is an absolute must in order to ensure a safe workplace for the teachers in the classrooms. And so they've been harping on in trying to launch a PR campaign to counter what parents are saying and many educators are saying. Bob Walsh, the head of the National Education Association of Rhode Island, one of the bigger teacher unions, one of the two big teacher unions in the state, has been making the rounds touting a study. And I'm going to play a clip from the Dan York show last week. And I've actually, to be fair, I'll post a link to the entire interview, but I have taken two snippets on the same subject that came at different points in the interview, so we're not listening to 16 minutes of it, but I took the two relevant clips regarding the study and how he's presenting it to the public and specifically people that he'd like to influence. And I thought that would be an interesting listen. And then we'll come back and take a look at some of his math and maybe some of the things that he didn't say. He also put a tweet out, which you'll see as we're listening.
I wrote that particular tweet to any elected official who is getting a little, what did you call it, knock-kneed or weak-kneed about giving the governor the authority to continue to issue emergency orders when needed on the masking issue in particular and other issues in general, because I referenced the parental support for continuing to have children attending school wear masks, at least for the time being. It was a convenient coincidence that the Hassenfeld Institute at Bryant did a Joe Fleming, very credible poll, and included a question to parents about mask wearing, because if you've got a couple of dozen emails from people in your district saying we don't want masks, I'm telling you that 80% of the parents in your district still think it's a good idea.
Okay, so that was the interview on Dan York. That was the tweet that he had put out that got him on the Dan York show that day. So let's take a look at the tweet. Let's take a look at the way the tweet was presented. And let's take a look at the study itself, because I think there's some things to be learned here. Okay, so first, the tweet, as we saw. We're going to notice first thing that he's very specific about the result that came through. 78.2%, not 78.1%, not 78.3%, 78.2%. And anytime you see someone who is using that much specificity in a percentage, it's cause for, I wouldn't say cause for concern, but it's a sign that perhaps they're trying to convince you that this is more specific and more accurate than it actually is. And in many quantitative career fields, they'll call this the myth of false precision. So he could have very easily said 78%. He could have said nearly 80%. We would have taken that. We would have taken more than 75%. But he went with this very specific looking number because there's people in the public that say, wow, I mean, they nailed it down to the 10th of a percentage point. So this has got to be a good, accurate result. Again, the technical term for that is false precision. He then talks about the opposition in very general terms, a handful of emails, handful of talk radio callers, and then kind of categorizes them as not having medical credentials. Many of them don't, to be fair. Many of them are parents who are working in fields other than, but we've got a very specific result, which kind of supports his side of the argument. And then it's just a handful of people on email and in talk radio. So a little bit of a mismatch there. The thing that he doesn't mention in there is how many respondents there were in this survey. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Now, we all, hopefully, maybe all know that the idea of a survey is to take an entire population of people. So in this case, it would be all parents with K through 12 aged students in the Rhode Island public school system. Take a sample of those, because you can't talk to all of them, but take a random sample of them, and then based on what you hear in that random sample, apply that to the greater population and reach a conclusion. So Bob Walsh's conclusion in this case is that 78.2%, nearly 80%, more than 75%, however you want to present it, but the vast majority of parents are in favor of masking their children in Rhode Island public schools. And then we get to the fact that the sample is 400. Now, on the face, even in a state as small as Rhode Island, 400 seems like a relatively small sample, but we'll take a closer look at that in just a second. But the Fleming and Associates, and I do have a link in the show notes to the actual study that the Hassenfeld study that's being thrown around in the media. You can go out and read it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. But from the introduction, they're telling you that the survey is a random sample of 400 parents in Rhode Island public school children. Here's where it gets interesting. So keep that 400 respondents number in the back of your mind. And then let's look at some of the information that's not necessarily drawn out or called out in the survey or in Bob Walsh's tweets. The first thing is that we know it's an agreed upon number that there's about 130,000 children enrolled in K through 12 public schools in the state of Rhode Island. We know this because that's the number that the state has used in our lawsuit on school masking, and we've not disputed it. So we've come to the agreement that that's a good enough working number. It might be 131,000, it might be 129,500, but we've agreed on 130,000 is close enough for what we're doing here. If we assume that there are 2.5 K through 12 children per household, so every house has 2.5 K through 12 children in it, then that means that there's 52,000 households with K through 12 children in the state, and that means that the polling company could have reached out to any one of 52,000 households. And the way we're getting there is just to take the number of children, 130,000, dividing it by children per household, and getting a number of households of 52,000. If we had assumed that there was one child per household, well, then we would have had 130,000 households. I bring that up because 2.5 seems to me to be a fairly conservative number. So it's not like I tried to tell you that there's only one child per household and therefore they could have gone out and talked to 130,000 different people. So I've tried to be conservative in this in order to make my point. So if we take that 52,000 households and we call that a reasonable estimate of what we have going on in the state, then the next question is, how many parents are there available to talk in each household? Now, not every household has two parents. There's divorce, there's situations where the parents aren't involved in the child's life. There could be situations where there's a divorce and one parent lives in Mass, one lives in Rhode Island, or Connecticut, Rhode Island. But let's make another conservative assumption and say that we have 1.25 parents living in any household. So you've got some with two, some with one, and on average that works out to 1.25 parents per household. That means that there are 65,000 parents that could have been interviewed for the survey, and that the survey company only talked to 400. So another quick numerical check. How do you feel about that? Well, 1% of that 65,000 parents would be 650 people. Again, survey company talked to 400, so well less than 1% of the available parents that they could have talked to. So the next question is, how influenced should elected officials feel? Bob made a tweet directed directly at school committees, the Rhode Island House of Representatives, and the Rhode Island State Senate. So let's take a look at how influenced or how threatened or how convinced those elected officials should be given Bob's tweet. So we know that there are 36 school committees in the state. If I assume that they talked to an equal number of people in each of those school committees, which is a very big open question on this survey. We don't know where the people were other than the fact that they were in Rhode Island. They could have all been in Providence, they could have all been in Barrington. Based on the results and where I live, I can tell you that it was not in the Foster-Gloucester area, but we don't know how evenly spread that sample was, of 400 responses was. We don't know where those people are for. But if we were to allocate them equally or spread them equally over 36 school committees, that means each school committee had 11 responses, which means that if I'm a school committee member and I look out at my parents as they show up for school committee meetings, they've talked to 11 in this survey. If I think about it in terms of a classroom, if I'm a school committee member and I think about the number of buildings in my school, in my school area, my school district, and I think about one elementary school, for example, and then I take one classroom, there's probably 20 kids in that classroom. And this survey may have talked to half the kids' parents in one classroom. It's a very small sample size and may or may not represent, a really quality sample that you could draw, deep conclusions and really feel good about that 80% supporting mask number. So that's the school committees. Then you've got the Rhode Island House of Representatives. The Rhode Island House of Representatives, there's 75 reps. Again, we take our 400 responses, divide that by 75 reps. That works out to a little bit better than 5 responses per rep. Again, if I'm getting dozens of emails from my constituents, and then Bob Walsh comes with a study and says, don't worry, 80% of parents support masking. And I ask, great, how many people in my district did you talk to? And Bob says, maybe 5. I'm probably not feeling super strong. And I may be taking that 80% conclusion with more than 1 grain of salt. And then similarly, there are 36 senators and I got a little typo there, a little bit of copy and paste punishment there. But there's 36 senators in the Rhode Island State Senate. And again, if I take the 400 and divide it by the 38 state senators, that's going to get me about 11 responses for each senator. And again, you talk to 11 people in my district. I'm a state senator. I've got the fancy license plate that says Rhode Island State Senate. I want to keep that license plate. How good do I feel about that 80% conclusion that's been reached in the survey based on what is a relatively small sample size for which we don't have a lot of underlying information. Full disclosure, in the Fleming and Associates write-up that comes with it, they do tell you that there's 400 in there. They give you a breakout for each question, demographics, gender, age of the child, or where they are in school, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school, whether it's an urban area, a rural or suburban area. But they're not telling you the actual demographics of the people who responded. So it's very difficult to get a read on who actually answered this survey. And candidly, there's diversity of opinion on the masking issue in this state. So, if you happen to oversample in a region or a town where masks are more prevalent, more accepted, more supported, you're going to get an 80% answer, particularly with a relatively small sample of 400 people. We'll have to see what happens. I know that the General Assembly, Rep. Filippi in particular, has asked for additional information and the data sets behind this, given the way that the survey is being used to push and influence legislators and public opinion on the issue of masking. So it'll be interesting to see if they get anywhere with that. At the end of the day, though, I think the more credible surveys are ones for which the entire data set and methodology are laid bare. My read of this is that they could have provided more information that would have allowed people to do a little bit of second order analysis to see exactly where the support was coming from and where it was not coming from. But that's not included in here, and I didn't pay for the survey, so I have no reason to expect that they would provide me with any additional information. A lawmaker requesting it, on the other hand, that might be a different story. So we'll wait and see what happens there. And so those are just kind of two everyday examples of what's happening in media on what are some very contentious issues. COVID relief money, where's that money going? Who's going to get it? It's going to be very interesting to see how that goes as we move through the political season. You've got a lot of money to spend. You've got a lot of people that would like it spent on them. And you've got a lot of COVID-related measures that are set to expire or are being questioned, or there's a sense that some of them need to be, if not eliminated, modified significantly based on where we are in the pandemic. So these sorts of survey results and studies and data sets are going to be flying around a lot, particularly in an election year. So I thought this was a good exercise tonight to take a closer look at a couple that were timely and, frankly, full disclosure, near and dear to my heart, particularly the school masking one. But there will be more. It is an election year. There's a lot of hot elections that will be going. So there's going to be stuff flying around all over the media, and I expect that I will be very busy looking at those, and to the extent that some of them are questionable or demonstrate a good life lesson for our kids, I'll certainly be sharing those on this platform. So that's where we are for the evening. I want to thank Keyshawn, as always, for making sure that I push the right buttons and put the right things up and the sound comes through and all the technology behind the scenes works the way it's supposed to. Again, thanks to the Coalition Radio Network. Hit the subscribe button, pick a thumb, leave a comment, let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree. Always happy to have the conversation. And once you've done those things, you can log off, and we will see you next week on the Self-Made Math. Thanks so much for tuning in.